Welcome everyone to the National Gallery. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for this Friday late, organised in conjunction with the Triumph of Art, the National Gallery's nationwide commission with Jeremy Della, supported by the Art Fund. My name is Imogen Tedbury, and I'm currently the Curator of Early Italian Paintings here at the National Gallery. And it is my huge privilege to be in conversation with artist and banner maker Ed Hall today, Britain's leading designer of marching banners for trade unions and other campaign groups. Very well deserved. And he is, of course, also a long-time collaborator of Jeremy Della and is working with Jeremy on the Triumph of Art commission. Ed has been making trade union campaign and exhibition banners for over 30 years. 40 years even, I'm not sure. We can talk more about that in a minute. And these beautiful works, some of which we'll be looking at together during this talk, are handmade, stitched, appliqued, and often include painted scenes as well as their centerpieces. Ed's work straddles political and social activism as well as the art world, and he has worked with a number of different campaign groups that I won't list here, but we'll talk more about some of them shortly. And his banners have graced Trafalgar Square and Nelson's Column too on numerous occasions, fronting large marches and processions of many kinds. But today we are in conversation inside the National Gallery, not outside. And here we are sitting among some of our masterpieces of Florentine painting. We are here in this gallery for a reason. We are sitting in front of the masterpieces of an artist today known as Pessolino. Pessolino means little p in Italian, a slightly spurious term for the male member. And Pessolino was the grandson of an artist called Pesello. Pesello was a banner maker, an artist who was a member of the Medici household. And we know that he painted banners for processions, for pageants, for Medici campaigns of all kinds in Florence in the mid-15th century. And Pessolino got his skills at design from his grandfather initially. And here we're sitting before his story of David and Goliath above and the Triumph of David below, a scene that really evokes the kind of cavalcades and processions that Pessolino and his contemporaries would have been familiar with in Florence. These are not banners, obviously, and yet they have many design elements that really speak to his early training. And we'll talk more, perhaps later on, about some of the kind of hints of banners and more ephemeral art that we can see in these works and other works in the collection. But I want to start now by asking you, Ed, about the sort of early days of your practice. You were trained as an architect, and you spent 30 years building social housing for Lambeth Council. You were also a trade unionist yourself. You were secretary of the Lambeth branch of Unison. How did you get into banner making, and do you remember your first banners that you made?
Well, no, it is fantastic to be in the National Gallery. I must thank you for the invitation. I got into, I spent 30 years in an office, and I'm not sure if offices exist now as they were when I was, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, but I did 30 years of it as a traditional office worker. I became involved in the trade union Unison when it was obvious that council housing would finish and the ones that were left would be sold off. The biggest mistake in British history, I feel. Because I got involved in the union, and eventually I became branch secretary of Lambeth Unison, and because banners were needed almost on a daily basis, partly because Lambeth Council decided to fight Margaret Thatcher, it was a bit of a David and Goliath, fight. It ended up with all 31 Labour councillors being disqualified from office. But I was because I could draw and make things and portraits, things didn't frighten me and I could get on with things. I ended up making banners for the council and the trade unions. And that's how it starts up, the 1986 onwards, so it's quite a long time. The reason that I think I have got reasonably well known is because I've been at it a long time, really. You know,
I don't think that's true, and we'll talk more about your very distinct style shortly. But can you tell us a bit, so you started, that was your sort of first project, and can you tell us a bit about some of the other organisations and unions you've made banners for?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was interested that I was going to talk with you, who's an expert on the early Renaissance, and obviously you've told me that banners were being paraded around Siena and Florence, you know, in that period. And then I thought, well, you know, there's a huge gap then of about 300 or 400 years before banners kicked off again, you know, and that's quite interesting. And I know people like Cromwell and armies had banners, but they're not in the public eye, and haven't survived. But I soon began to make banners for trade union branches. I've even made national banners, which is a huge privilege. And I got involved with the campaigns that existed at the time, notably CND and Stop the War, which sort of, in some ways, Stop the War, I think, will be seen quite significant when history gets written, because it was a huge sort of anti-war movement, and there are remnants of it, obviously, today, you know, so.
Yeah, it's, we'll talk more about the history of banners maybe later on, but it is interesting thinking about banners in that context compared to, say, the kind of military banners you describe with Cromwell and his armies, or even, in fact, the armies of Renaissance Italy as well. Banners for a very different audience, with very different meanings, I think.
Yes. I mean, if I can break from I just want to show a couple of things. I've recently had the privilege of being in France now, and they've got the storming of the Bastille was 1789, and in the Musée Cavalet is a banner made in 1790, which celebrates 1 year of the storming of the Bastille, and that's still in existence. So I was a big thrill to see that, and it's there. And then I'll just quickly get in this, because I just found this absolutely fascinating, that in the same museum is this set of earrings, which presumably women were wearing in the 1790s. It starts off with the capot rouge, the middle is the guillotine, and the bottom of it is Marie Antoinette's head. and I mean, presumably people were wearing it. I mean, you know, that's kind of
revolutionary design at its best. Yeah.
And then it's interesting for me that because we were the first, well, Manchester was the first city to be industrialised. Britain was the first country to be industrialised. If you look at the history of Manchester and, you know, Peterloo and all the rest of it, I think people honestly thought that the French Revolution would come into the northern cities, and there are reasons why it didn't, but it did, with the Reform Act of 1832, other things, it did in one sense. So, but anyway, I couldn't resist showing these earrings, I just think.
Well, you have an eye for design, I would say. And that is actually, I mean, picking up on that, what you've just traced there is a kind of, I suppose, a lineage of banner making from revolutionary France to the kind of work that you're making today, via Peterloo and via the kind of social movements of the early 19th century in this country. I mean, we've spoken in the past about this sort of very distinct banner making banner making tradition that we have here in Britain, which you are very much at the kind of forefront of at the moment, but how distinct that is from the kinds of banners in continental Europe. I mean, for example, in Italy, banners are perhaps associated with religious processions, with confraternities, images of the Madonna, and those that certainly survive from the kind of period of the paintings in this room are works that were made with that kind of purpose. But you're part of a different tradition in this country.
No, I think that's one of the sort of, if anyone was writing a sort of an academic essay, I think that would be quite an interesting subject. Why pictorial banners picked up in Britain in the 1830s, and they never did for the trade unions and campaigns, and they never did in France and Italy. And there are all sorts of reasons. Maybe the population was quite happy for the pictorial banners to be in religious settings, and because you could see a big May Day demonstration down the Champs-Élysées, there wouldn't be a single pictorial banner there. And I've seen left demonstrations in Italy, and there's, again, they're just text banners. So I think I think the other thing is, which is interesting for me, there are all sorts of reasons why banners ended up as they are in Britain, but it is a lot to do with the two architects Percier and Fontaine, who Napoleon and Josephine hired to create the Empire style. And it was incredibly infectious because everyone was wearing the clothes and the scrolls, the Rococo borders. So I think when the trade unions began to spend an awful lot of money on their silk-woven banners, they had already had a vocabulary from the Empire style, which suited their politics because it came from France. And I think that's part of the reason that they look the same. And when I make banners, which I hope you'll have a look at a bit to come, that they echo the same kind of history, that same kind of thing, which for some just didn't kick off in Italy and France.
I think that's fascinating. And talking of vocabulary, I think we should look at some of your banners now. I mean, I think everyone here would be really interested to hear more from you about your design process, how you approach these kinds of commissions, how you work with your commissioners, the kinds of back and forth that you have. So please tell us a bit about this example here, which is one of your most recent banners.
No, this is Ella, who's here. I worked in collaboration with Ella Jones and the workers of. I mean, I made a joke with Imogen earlier, saying, "Well, you might be the National Gallery, but this is the United Voices of the world." I mean, this is a banner made for workers with the least rights. They're people who work in people's homes or in domestic situations, cafes and cleaning jobs. They can be sacked in an instant. They're slowly bringing their sort of workers' power in their organisation, the United Voices of the World. And they're sort of, if I can just point out a couple of things. One is they were very keen to have sackcloth in the banner because it represents the sort of honest, lowest sort of workers kind of material. And a lot of it is in Spanish because a lot of these workers come from the Philippines or from Spain. And so I went to very privileged to go to the Christmas party at the United Voices of the World. And it was an entirely Spanish-speaking Christmas party. And although I don't speak Spanish, you don't really, after a couple of glasses of Rioja, you don't really have to mind too much. And I did. That was a real joy in making that with all the symbolism. And Ella drew the figures, which are brilliant. There was collaboration with some of the stitching. So that was a collaboration, and it was out in an industrial dispute recently, and it looked great in the sunshine.
And, but if I might, if we could, oh yeah, and let's look at the back as well. Great.
If I can mention something else as well, I happen to make the PCS Culture Group banner, which includes workers of the National Gallery. And the National Gallery is actually on the banner. And I was asked to bring this banner tonight, but I can't because it's on duty in Liverpool, where there are 4 disputes with all the art galleries of Liverpool. And they've sent me an email saying they couldn't let me have it for the night, but saying what an inspiration it was to their dispute. So it's working, you know.
Well, it's working. You make working art, art that has a purpose.
Yes.
I mean, just picking up on that, while our wonderful colleagues here get out another wonderful example of your work. I mean, I've been struck looking at examples of your work today with you. There's a synergy between the way you design banners. You know, they have a certain, you have a really recognizable style, a signature style, which I'd love to hear more about, how you approach these banners, the kind of formats that you use. But they're also extremely distinctive in their approach to figures and their approach to symbols and designs, different typefaces, different colors. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you've evolved a style that is at once very consistent and yet also very varied in this way.
Yeah, I mean, they are sort of handmade and they start from scratch, although there is a kind of vocabulary to banners, the title, a slogan, a centerpiece, and possibly figures at the bearers, at the side. So there is a sort of, in some ways they design themselves. But this one is interesting because in the early days, I mean, this is 25 years old when it's now called Unite Against Racism, but it was the Anti-Nazi League, and it was extremely influential and had all kinds of fingers in all kinds of political parties and in political thinking. And I managed to fish that out of a skip. So I was, when they changed their name, a lot of the banners went with the name. But anyway, I managed to save that one. So I'm really pleased about it. And although they probably wouldn't say it now, there are a lot of people sitting in the House of Commons who were keen members of the Anti-Nazi League. So.
And how long would it take you to make something like this? Like,
well,
what's the kind of
the one we had I've decided now, they take, if you put your head down and charge, it's about 2.5 weeks. And although there is there is travel and consultation that goes with it,
Yes, of course. And maybe and I want to ask you a bit more about your collaboration with Jeremy and about that work. So how did you meet? How did you first meet Jeremy?
Well, I am very privileged to be a friend of Jeremy Deller's because apart from the fact that he's taken me all around the world, and that's quite an advantage, but I have had an understanding of the arts through him, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't make things to nail on a wall. He has created a vision of the arts in pulling through every strand of society, and I think he also has when he speaks on, there are all sorts of subjects that people talk about, the empire, Englishness, what is Britain, all those subjects which he tackles without any problem whatever and explains them all, puts them in artistic form. His knowledge and his folk and clog dancing and all those kind of things that seem a bit, there's one exhibit he had at the Manchester Festival of sort of people who smoke obsessively, and that was sort of like an art exhibit, So he gets into things that on the face of it seem a bit trivial, but they're not, they're a fascinating person.
And so how did you meet?
Well, I was putting up a stall in Brockwell Park for the country show, and about 8 o'clock in the morning, because I was putting it up on behalf of Unison, his parents live by Brockwell Park, and he was just going for a walk at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we had a long, long talk, and I didn't have a clue who he was, and that was about 25 years ago. And then a bit later on, he phoned me and asked me to. This is a story which which is dear to me. I'd made a banner about the bombing, the Brixton bomb, and he said, could he borrow it for an exhibition? on the phone. So I said, well, yeah, I mean, I said, wherever you want to bring it, I'll bring it. Oh, well, he said, that won't be necessary because the tape will pick it up. And I thought, God, I almost fell off my chair, you know. Anyway, that was my meeting. And he has, I mean, in terms of friendship, he's been a very good friend, very good friend.
So when your work initially sort of came into Jeremy's work, as it were, this was a banner that you'd already made. It had a sort of a life before, a working life, if you like your banner currently in Liverpool, doing its work. But other banners that you've made for Jeremy are works that you've made more in collaboration with him. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I made, when he did the Manchester International Festival, that had 20 banners going down Deansgate. Each section had to have a banner to kick it off, so I made those. And he recently had an exhibition in Rennes. He virtually gave me a free hand to make the exhibition banner for that, which is really, that was his idea actually, but it was of an artist painting the medieval part of Rennes, but she's not actually painting the building, she's painting an advert for the exhibition, you know, so that was quite a good, a lovely project.
And so that design, if you like, that kind of emblem was something which you sort of came up with and sort of pitched and was agreed between the two of you. And how do you think, is that the kind of process you have with your other commissioners as well? Like, how would you approach, we have another of your more recent banners here as well, don't we?
No,
Something you've just
a lot
finished.
of this one, funnily, I finished this week actually, but it's for the black workers of the GMB, which is a huge union, and there were loads and loads of consultation that went into it, and they're all, you can see how the consultation is sort of obvious, really. There's, you know, the Windrush landing in Tilbury. This has really fascinated me. There was a strike in a bubblegum factory in Bristol, which was interesting. Then this is, again, you learn such a lot. There was a reference here to the Bristol bus boycott when the management of the Bristol buses refused to employ black workers. And there was there's no criticism of an existing union, but it was very difficult putting it on the banner because one of the organisations resisting the employment of black workers was a trade union, and that was a fascinating thing to learn. And then at the end is that famous dispute, the Grunwick dispute, which caught the imagination of huge numbers of people, and it's quite fascinating actually to walk through including the postal workers, because they refused to deliver as a film processing company, and the postal workers refused to deliver packages to Grunwick. But it is amazing to walk down that road where the Grunwick factory was, and it's so quiet now. It's a suburban street, and the things that happen in life, and now it's just quiet now, and it's all gone, But the other thing I must mention about this, the GMB is a huge union, huge manual union, and for ever since I've known, it's orange is its colour, and then I don't want to tread on people's toes, but we were in a workshop designing the banner, talking about it, and the General Secretary of the GMB arrives, and he's obviously, this is not a comment on him at all, it's just a comment on life. He's from Scotland with an orange background, so he begins to explain to these black workers about the colour orange, and they're just looking at him completely in disbelief, you know, so that was a really funny afternoon, you know.
Well, I mean, that particular anecdote, I think, really speaks to your own knowledge and experience of working with so many different organisations. I mean, you must have worked with more unions than anyone else, really, having this kind of insight. And I suppose banner making as well. I mean, this is something, this really, making a banner of this kind really gets to the heart of what organisations are about, doesn't it? You're asking people about how they want to be represented.
Yeah, and I am lucky because I do get into the most amazing meetings. The best one I ever got into, the Church of England had one race, which was a very early campaign. And I ended, because everything that was designed had to go in front of the top people, I ended up in a room with the Methodist moderator, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop of Westminster. You know, and they had to approve what was doing. The other thing that does stick in my mind was I did some banners for the post office, the CWU, and I was in a meeting with their top people, and there was all the privatisation of the post office, the fall in letter posts, all these issues, and they were discussing it, and they weren't like rabid, you know, sort of wreckers. They were discussing it and saying, what is possible? How can we use industrial action to beat privatisation? And to be part of that conversation was quite amazing.
Well, I think your work really represents and also celebrates many of these people, and people, particularly people holding banners and people holding placards, are a kind of a visual thread that runs through a lot of your banners, certainly that I've seen examples of your work that I've seen. And I wondered if you could sort of talk a little more about that. I mean, you have developed this style of banner making and a way of working that is really, I think, how we would all think of what banners look like today. And you said to me earlier when we were chatting, you said you could turn on the 6 o'clock news on a Saturday and see a picture of your banner, a banner of yours on the TV almost every week. That must be extraordinary.
Yeah, no, that is quite a lovely experience to. That's the interesting thing. In a world where everything is digital, everything is in a graphic design studio, everything is hard edge, but you can make something which is completely handmade, handcrafted. I mean, I even work to my great shame, I even work in feet and inches, you know. And but on the other hand, the media sort of pick it up, and once it's picked up on a television camera, then it becomes digital. It becomes the very thing that is, and that is. Then when I make banners, what I'm trying to think of is some guy or some woman is taking the film, then that goes in front of the editor of the 6 o'clock news, or you've got to think of something that would excite the interests of an editor. That's what I try and think of sometimes.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating to me. So when you're making your banners, you're thinking of the audience in the crowd, but you're also thinking about a digital audience, a kind of international audience, if you like, of people who may see your banners by way of a different media.
Yes. And you can be extremely lucky. I mean, that when they had that tuition fees dispute some years ago, the Times thought that was a really important dispute, and they were plastering my banners all over the Times, for days. I just couldn't believe it, but you can get lucky,
Not just lucky. But part of this long tradition, I mean, I'm certainly struck looking at your banners, the resemblance that they have to something like suffragette banners, for example, and the way that those historic banners use text in similar ways, use symbols in similar ways. I wondered, you've spoken about designing your banners for a bigger audience, but do people copy your banners? Do you come across imitators of your banners?
I think I have produced a format which I have seen copied, which is great. And I do know people come in and out of their careers, and I do know a group of people who make banners, and they're wonderful. They come and stay with us sometimes. And there is a sort of banner making industry. I mean, it's nothing on the scale of the silk woven banners of Tootil and the 19th century, nothing like that. And I don't think anyone could seriously get a mortgage out of making banners, but anyway, there are people making. Now, just a quick one on this. This is a scene of when there was quite a famous people blocked Waterloo Bridge, and they were turfing it and planting trees as part of the Green Initiative about 2 or 3 years ago. And this was done for the South Bank, and it was actually hung on the festival hall, which I was absolutely thrilled about, because it's Grade 1 listed, and they nailed this banner on the side of it. But that wasn't, and I walked over Westminster Bridge while they were doing this greening and making it. But I just thought that I thought it's so important, this issue, because it's no point even having socialism if there isn't any earth left. I mean, that's a real big issue. And that lovely Greta Thunberg, and who gave talks in the festival hall at the time. It's it really is difficult to see where the green movement goes. I mean, I drive a car, for instance, and people go on holidays and fly. The whole thing is a very complex issue.
I think perhaps we're coming to a close, and I want to make sure we have time to ask questions from our audience as well. But I want to sort of end with a kind of reflection on your work's sort of endurance, and your. I'm interested in where your work is and how it. You mentioned you've got a banner currently at work in Liverpool, but your other banners must be spread all over the country in all kinds of organisations, in the possession of different people. We spoke earlier about an archive of sorts that you have of your banners currently in someone else's possession, but there isn't a kind of an archive and index of that kind. I'm particularly interested in this in the setting where we are standing currently. The paintings on the walls of the National Gallery are not banners. They are not working objects in the sense that they are made in the context of the work that you make. And yet, many of these objects work quite hard. They work quite hard in different ways, as religious images, as images with significance to different people. But these are the works that survive, and the banners of Renaissance Italy, for one, do not survive in the most part. What do you think the kind of legacy of your work is? How do you sort of see the survival of your work? How many banners do you think you've made?
Well, I must have made about 600 altogether, and some of them are secure, like in the Museum of London, which I don't think will go bust anytime soon because it's funded by the City of London. But and some of them are in the British Council and in Rennes and all sorts of places. So I think there will be some which are pretty safe. I mean, the ones that are not safe and just be discarded as ephemera, they do get discarded. And I have been asked to track down, say, Jeremy might say, well, you get hold of 20 banners and then you start searching for them. It's more difficult than you think. People, they change ownership, they get lost, the most famous banner in the world is possibly Robert Tressel, who wrote The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, made a socialist banner for Hastings. And they thought, well, it was true. The Germans would have been, that was the first target they had for invasion. So they hid this banner made by Robert Tressel in Hastings. And then somebody took it up to Birmingham for safety. And that was the end of it. And if somebody could put their hand on that, what a wonderful thing that would be.
And I suppose, if you don't mind, just one more question from me. How do you feel when you see your work being displayed in a gallery rather than held by a union or by a group on the street in procession, as it were? And this is, I suppose, the last example we have to show our audience here today.
Oh, yeah, this is, I have, every autumn, there's a parade down Whitehall of usually young men who've died in police custody, and it still goes on. And the reason they die is because if somebody sits on you and restrains you, you slowly begin to lose oxygen, and the more you struggle, the worse it gets. You know, it's a horrible cycle. And this was one of the early ones I made about Brian Douglas, and I have made a lot of deaths in custody banners, and obviously the family I never meet the person, obviously, and I have to unveil it in front of the family, and I've never had a bad reaction, you know, so, you know, I'm, you know, in one sense, pleased about that, but that's still a pretty raw issue, you know, of sort of police life and the lives of young black men in London. I mean, that is an issue.
Well, I think your work demonstrates the power of images and the activism that the images can perform in your work.
Thank you, Ed. It's been a real pleasure. I'm now going to open this up to questions from the floor. Please, fire away.